So welcome everybody to the OurCrowd Tuesday teach-in. We do these twice a month, both for our investors, for entrepreneurs, and anyone else interested sort of in cutting-edge technology and the startup process and the investment process. We cover a lot of different material here. We're also really accessible in terms of topics, so if you have interesting topics you'd like us to talk about, please let us know. Typically we're joined by an expert, either an insider or outsider. Today we'll talk about who our guest is. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we start. There will be an opportunity to ask questions. So I know I got a couple via email before the event. There's an Ask a Question button in your Meeting Burner panel. So if you have a question throughout the presentation, please submit that. We'll break for a Q&A at the end. So I'd like to finish the entire session within an hour to let everybody get back to work or to head home for the day, depending what geography you're in. Those questions will come through to me. I'll ask them verbally to our guest presenter today. If there is a question that you'd like to follow up with, there'll be some contact information at the end of the presentation, either for me or for our guest presenter. We're always helpful, and happy to respond to questions. So it's great to see the overwhelming interest. We have a couple hundred people who are signed up for this event today. If you have any questions, as I said, please follow up with us. There'll also be a recording. I am recording this right now. I will send out an email probably tomorrow with a link and the slides as well as you'll see tonight. So if you have further questions, you can see that. Anyway, without further ado, tonight's topic is how MedTech companies get paid. Here at OurCrowd, we're an equity crowdfunding platform. It's a question we get asked a lot when we do a MedTech deal. Investors, whether they are insiders, whether they have familiarity with the U.S. Healthcare system, when we do a MedTech deal, we always have questions invariably about reimbursement and how that works. And so rather than tell you what I know, which is relatively little, we invited in Fauzea Hussain, who's a Vice President at Avalere Health. I'll let Fauzea do a presentation. She'll be presenting tonight, and I'll let her introduce herself in just a second. But clearly, this is an interesting issue when you're looking at early-stage companies, and it's something that was interesting enough and important enough that I asked Fauzea to present tonight. So I guess without further ado, Fauzea, would you like to introduce yourself and your firm?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Fauzea Hussain. As Zach mentioned, I'm a Vice President at Avalere Health. We are a strategic advisory firm located here in Washington, D.C. We work with a range of customers in the U.S. as well as globally, including large and small life sciences companies, medical device companies, technology developers, really quite a broad range of folks within the healthcare spectrum. I've been with Avalere for over 8 years, and my experience is around physician coding and payment, as well as looking at how the evolving U.S. marketplace, the focus on integrated delivery networks, is affecting product commercialization and market adoption. I head up our activities with physician societies and also lead our efforts around payment and delivery reform more broadly. So I'm excited to be here with you today and to talk to you about the evolving U.S. marketplace and answer any questions that you may have at the end specific to your technologies. But overall, I'll give you a high-level overview of how the market is changing in the U.S. and what that means for product development and some key considerations to keep in mind as you think about developing a product, but also in terms of life cycle management to ensure that you are supporting your products throughout their life cycle. Great.
So Fauzea, I am manning the slide, so we're on slide 3, if you'd like to start there.
Sure, that would be fine. So as I mentioned, the healthcare system here in the United States is evolving fairly rapidly over the last few years since the passage and the implementation of the Affordable Care Act, which is oftentimes referred to as Obamacare. And a lot of the shift in that has occurred because of the focusing on expanding coverage for the uninsured population here in the U.S., but also changing the way that care is delivered. So shifting away from a system that was reimbursing providers on a fee-for-service basis, meaning that you are just getting paid and rewarded based on the volume of services that you are performing. The new system is evolving much more rapidly towards a value-based system in which we are rewarding providers based on quality and being efficient. So reducing healthcare expenditures where appropriate, but also meeting quality thresholds to ensure that patients are still getting optimal care and are also getting longer-term care that is linked to improved outcomes. And these changes are really affecting the way that not only physicians and hospitals are making clinical decisions, but it's also affecting the way that life sciences companies are looking at product commercialization. So where before the system may have been focused in on, coverage, coding, and payment, you get a CPT code that reflects your service or your technology. Then you can go to a payer, and it's likely to get covered, and you're going to get paid. It's really not the environment that we're working in now, and it's only going to get more challenging in the future. Really, it's about thinking, what is the value of my technology? What is the value of my device in the marketplace? How do I demonstrate that value to different stakeholders? Because the stakeholder complexity has really increased. So FDA approval is only the first bar that you have to pass here in the U.S. to support product commercialization. You really have to take a look at, where is my technology going to be used? Is this a service offering for the inpatient hospital acute care setting? Is this a technology that will be used in a hospital outpatient department, or is it really targeting physician offices? So understanding where the technology is going to be used is critical, because there are different payment systems that are in place in the U.S. for each of those different settings of care. So if you're thinking about, for example, an inpatient technology in the U.S., those services are often paid on a single payment rate for an inpatient stay. And then the hospital is incentivized to be as efficient as they can be in whatever that negotiated payment is for that patient's stay. So there are incentives there. But the system is evolving to becoming more bundled, to becoming more consolidated across settings of care and across providers. And that's why it's important to know, where is that service going to be used, and then what are the changes that are happening within that segment. And maybe we can go to the next slide, Zach. So as I mentioned, oftentimes our customers have been thinking about product commercialization or development in these sort of two buckets. You're looking at the development of the product. What do I need to do to obtain FDA approval? And that has been the focus. You design your research and development protocols at that level. You may take a look and say that it is more cost efficient for me to use a predicate device or an already FDA-approved device or technology that's on the market as a foundation for my FDA review in order to expedite the time that it would take me to generate evidence and come to the market. And then, you think about the commercialization of kind of like phase two. Well, I've got FDA approval. Now I'll work with payers and providers and get paid for my technology. But really, that has changed. Zach, if we can go to the next slide. Really, you need to start thinking about the commercialization environment earlier in product development. You really need to be thinking about, what do I need base level for FDA approval? But really, what is the additional evidence that I'm going to need to, one, either differentiate myself from a predicate device or existing technology? And what are the triggers in the marketplace that are going to support adoption or utilization of my technology that I am developing? So for example, a good case study here in the U.S. is around congestive heart failure remote monitoring. These are technologies that in some form or fashion have been in the marketplace for a number of years, but historically have seen strong resistance to adoption and utilization more broadly in the marketplace, even though they are FDA approved. The marketplace has evolved, however, that payers are willing to test the utilization of these technologies because their environment has shifted. Even though the evidence base may not be as robust as traditionally desired by some payers, we do see payers start to test or pilot or experiment with the use of these technologies because they see that the value here might be reductions in congestive heart failure readmissions. That reduction in readmissions is a value add for a facility in terms of their reimbursement from both public and private payers. This focus on reducing cost and improving patient outcomes can make technologies that once were not widely utilized or widely accepted, it gives them a little bit more of an edge for differentiation. And that doesn't mean that every congestive heart failure remote monitoring technology is equal. It really is about defining the differentiation in the marketplace, ensuring that you have an evidence base that resonates with a payer or that resonates with a facility to entice them to partner with you to test the technology. And as you're developing that evidence base and as you are developing utilization in the marketplace, that further supports your commercialization efforts. And so as you're looking at your technology and the development cycle, it is really important to think about who are your target customers and what is the data or evidence that you will need to make the value message to that entity relative to looking at the evidence that you're going to need in a silo purely for FDA approval. And usually the recommended time frame to take a look at those types of issues is as you're moving into your phase 2 clinical trial. It's an opportune time to ensure that you have the appropriate clinical endpoints available that will resonate with those stakeholders. And in the U.S., as we think about the evolving payer models, we are seeing greater partnership across stakeholders, and so those value messages are continuing to evolve fairly rapidly. So before, where in a traditional model we may have seen that you get FDA approval and your target audience might be a physician, let's say, to use a particular device or technology. Now that that physician is an employee of the hospital or is partnering with a hospital because they're participating in an accountable care organization or they're a member of an integrated delivery network, that locus of decision-making may no longer lie with the physician. It may actually lie with the hospital administrator, the hospital CEO. In many cases, for larger, more integrated delivery networks or health systems here in the U.S., that decision-making may rely at the corporate level. And so not only are you thinking about the evidence more broadly, but who's the decision maker that is going to affect utilization and adoption of that technology? In some cases, it may not be the physician. It may be that higher level, corporate entity or C-suite level individual that you need to engage. And of course, there are different demands and different needs based on who you're engaging. Where the physician may have been initially focused in on the clinical efficacy, safety, outcomes, you might find that engaging at that corporate level for a technology, the discussion there may shift to reduction in health services utilization, prevention of readmissions, overall efficiency in care delivery, cost reduction. And so you need to ensure that you have that clinical safety and efficacy information that obviously resonates and is required for FDA approval, resonates with the clinician, but also potentially this additional layer that will resonate with a rather diverse set of individuals at that corporate level as well. So as we're thinking about commercialization here in the U.S., it is really about incorporating that perspective earlier in your life cycle development. Another area that we often work with our customers on understanding is what is the current landscape or marketplace for a particular technology, and taking a look at how coverage now is for a particular device and then adjusting your clinical protocol or approach to differentiate yourself in the marketplace. So as I mentioned earlier, oftentimes in the device space or med technology space, you may see FDA approval based on a predicate device. What sometimes folks miss is that the payers are likely to have a policy in place for that initial or predicate device or technology. And it's important to understand what that is in advance, because if there is a lack of evidence or if that predicate technology or device is viewed to be experimental or investigational or lacking clinical value, you have to have a very strong message platform that then differentiates your technology from that technology. However, if your FDA approval is based on that predicate or additional, previously approved technology, oftentimes there's very little room for differentiation. So you have to take a look and figure out long-term for your product, for its life cycle management, is it more efficient? Is it better for you to actually go for a unique approval versus going through a predicate approval pathway? And that's one area that we work with a number of companies on a global level, particularly in this marketplace, to understand. Another area to think about as you're looking at either investments or focusing your energies on particular therapeutic areas is to understand where the market needs are changing and evolving. So as I mentioned earlier, as we're shifting into a value-based environment, there are opportunities for differentiation or value demonstration in technologies, devices, or services that are overall helping reduce healthcare costs. So remote monitoring devices and technologies are a particular focus here in the U.S. in terms of development. If they can show that better patient management in the home can lead to changes in patient care that therefore lead to reduction in hospital readmissions or better management of patients. This is really a growing area of focus in the U.S. marketplace as providers look for unique solutions to manage these patients. And this focus is really driven by the fact that the U.S. market is shifting into a more risk-based environment. So as we think about, you're getting reimbursed not on your volume, you're getting reimbursed on your value. In the U.S., a lot of that is being driven by the consolidation in the marketplace towards accountable care organizations, which is an organization of providers that agree to take on management of patients at a financial risk if they do not reduce costs and improve outcomes. And because providers are willing to take on that risk, the provider, you will find now, is a much more sophisticated consumer of medical device and technologies. The provider is really becoming more focused in on the cost utility argument that maybe they weren't as focused in on before. And that's another key area of development here in the U.S. in terms of product development is those messages around cost utility as well as clinical utility as providers take on a greater set of risks. And as we're adding to the layers of stakeholders that you have to keep in mind as you develop your value message and evidence base for a new technology or device, you also have to keep in mind the growing role of the physician societies in terms of clinical guidelines and clinical pathways. The guidelines here in the U.S. are often used as a foundation for developing the quality measures that are used to evaluate provider performance in this new value-based payment environment. So the guidelines are drivers for establishing what is the standard of care, what is that metric. And of course, providers have to meet those quality metrics in order to get paid or get their checkbox for participation in a value-based program. So those quality measures are very critical. Quality measures can be implemented in a number of different ways, and we also see the guidelines being implemented in a number of different ways. So as you're thinking about your product and your product portfolio more broadly, it's very good to take a look at what are the clinical societies positioning on existing technologies or existing therapeutic areas so that you have a sense of what is the evidence that I will need to either support gaps that are already in place or to overturn potentially a negative position or a poor positioning of the existing product that's on the market. And when we're thinking about providers, again, as I mentioned, are being measured on their performance based on these quality measures, but they're also looking towards evidence-based guidelines to support their clinical decisions. So as providers are taking on risk, as they're looking at reducing healthcare costs, they rely on these evidence-based guidelines to sort of be the safety net, the foundation for their clinical decision-making, to show that they are appropriately adhering to standards of care that are being established by physician societies. We see also a proliferation and growth in the use of clinical pathways to influence clinical decision-making. So clinical pathways can be ones that are developed from the clinical guidelines. They can be developed by the physician societies, or they can also be developed or modified by individual practices. So for example, you can take a look at oncology pathways that may be used by the Mayo Clinic may be very different than ones that are used at Johns Hopkins, because even though they might be following the same foundational base, let's say, of the guidelines, they're being modified based on the clinical practice preferences and experiences of the oncologists at each of those facilities respectively. And so that creates a lot of variation, a lot of differences in influence in how physicians or how providers are taking a look at evidence when making decisions for care delivery. And so as you're looking at the development of a product and that evidence base, again, it's important to take a broader look at what's happening in terms of perceptions or treatment algorithms or protocols in the marketplace to see where your technology could be advantaged or where it could be disadvantaged, particularly where you may be disadvantaged and thinking about what is the evidence base, what are the clinical endpoints that I would need to generate to overturn or overcome that disadvantage within the system. Because we are seeing this greater focus on the use of clinical pathways as a way of creating clearer or more direct decision-making across providers and across patients, which is believed to overall improve patient outcomes, and reduction of that variation can also lead to reduction in healthcare costs more broadly. Zack, maybe I'll pause there for a second and see if there's any questions on that component.
Yes, so as I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, Fauzea is open to answering questions. Fauzea, we do have two different components of our audience. I see on the line we have both entrepreneurs as well as investors. So if you have a question for Fauzea, please submit it via the Ask a Question button in your webinar panel, and I will be able to ask that for you. We haven't had any come through directly yet during the webinar. Was there another piece of the pie that you were going to address right now?
Yeah, no, we can continue on until there are questions, and it's helpful to break up the audience into those two key components. So oftentimes we do engage with entrepreneurs who are in early stage development of a technology, whether it's a device, it's a remote monitoring technology, or oftentimes even web-based tools or smart apps, very unique and novel technologies that could have clinical improvement or a place in the marketplace. And I think that oftentimes the challenge is trying to figure out, what is the best pathway for a unique and novel technology to come to market here in the U.S. And it's important to be mindful of whether it is beneficial for you to target the development of your product towards a payer, or is it better to target the value messages of a product to the patient directly. So we have worked with companies who have developed technologies, let's say within a physical therapy space, where you can use your game unit, your Kinect, to monitor the patient's activities, or you can use your smartphone app to help you with particular types of exercises, or you can use a smartphone app to help collect your biometric data and gives you a feedback loop. These are very unique, very novel approaches to improving adherence, to improving patient outcomes. The challenge can oftentimes be is who will be the target for that type of a technology. And if it's a payer, the evidentiary bar may be much higher than you as an entrepreneur are willing to invest in up front. However, direct to consumer in some cases may be the better avenue, as the evidentiary threshold for the consumer may be lower. We also see physician societies taking a role in the use of these novel and unique technologies and advocating or endorsing or supporting particular types of products. We know that the American Physical Therapy Association has signed their name on to a physical therapy app that provides guidance on different types of exercises to improve patient outcomes. So really from the entrepreneurial perspective, there's a lot of opportunity. Again, I think it's just important to be targeted in terms of who is the audience, who will be using it, where are the value messages, and where is an opportunity for you to show that value to that target consumer. In terms of the investor audience, I would say as you're looking at investments, it is very important to understand the broader evolving marketplace here in the U.S. to determine where there are going to be additional pressures or constraints. I think it's also important to take a look at the service or technology that's already in existence to say, can I use an existing code for coverage coding and payment purposes in the U.S.? If I do match to an existing code, what has been the trend in reimbursement for that code over the course of the last 5 years? Is there a risk that that service could be a target for reductions more broadly in the future? If so, what is the magnitude of that reduction? I think that's always important to assess. When you're thinking about devices that may be used in the physician office setting of care, they're often built into a code. And because they're built into a code, even though you're a unique and new technology, you may again be mapping to a code and then tied to the payment that's in place for that code, reducing your opportunity in the longer term. You may also want to think about, is there an opportunity for differentiation for that service or technology in the U.S. market to obtain its own unique code? If you can obtain a unique code, do you have the evidence base that supports the creation of that code? Coding in the U.S. is step one in terms of establishing an opportunity for reimbursement for a technology. But again, it's only step one. You also have to think about the coverage. Just because there's a code in place doesn't necessarily mean that a public or private payer is reimbursing for that service. So it's important to take a look at the coding, but it's also important to take a look at the payer coverage landscape. And oftentimes payers will provide a rationale for why they are covering a product or why they are restricting coverage of a product. So it gives you a lens into the payer's perspective or review of the clinical literature and allows you to take a look at your own clinical development approach to see if you are going to be able to meet those payer demands or address any concerns or issues that the payer may have for a particular technology or service. And as I mentioned again, the guidelines and the pathways are also critical.
So you bring up some great points there, Fauzea. So I was going to ask a question, and it just came through actually through the ask a question button in the meeting burner panel. Is there a publicly available resource to determine current reimbursement rates? I guess per payer.
So typically for Medicare, you can find the payment rates because our Medicare program here, which is for age 65 and over, and also for some very specific subpatient populations who might be under the age of 65, you can find the payment rates for CPT codes publicly for Medicare. Most commercial payers keep that information close to the vest. As you can imagine, it's proprietary contract negotiations between the commercial payer and the individual provider. But oftentimes, if you can map yourself to an existing CPT code, then you can pull publicly the Medicare payment rates and make some general assumptions about what the commercial market may look like.
Great. A question came through earlier. I guess more from an investor point of view. Can you talk a little bit more about the mechanics of reimbursement, how that works?
Sure, happy to. So, first and foremost, you have to have FDA approval for a particular technology or device in the U.S. So once you have FDA approval, you need to see if there are CPT codes. Now, CPT codes are current procedural terminology codes. These are codes that represent services that are performed by a provider. The CPT codes are owned by the American Medical Association, and they are essentially sort of developed and run through a committee that includes multi-specialty physicians. And so once you have a code, there are two types of codes that you can obtain. The first type of CPT code is a Category 1 code. Category 1 code is kind of like your gold star code, and it's what everybody wants. You have to have 5 peer-reviewed literature articles, which is that evidentiary base I mentioned earlier, in order to even base level qualify for a Category 1 code. And then you also have to show that the service that you are performing is one that is widespread in medical clinical practice. And widespread is going to be really determined based on the nature of the service. So for some procedures, a volume of, let's say, 200 a year is going to be sufficient, where in other therapeutic areas you might need 2,000 to show that a service is widely being utilized. Those are your Category 1 codes. Those get valued by the AMA, and that's really what's driving that public transparency around the Medicare payment rates that I mentioned. The second type of code is a Category 3 code. Category 3 codes are for those codes or services that aren't quite meeting that Category 1 bar. These are viewed as being emerging or developing technologies. Category 3 codes may even be used for services or procedures that are FDA approved but are not meeting that evidentiary threshold or are not currently being viewed as widely performed in clinical practice. They may also be used for technologies that are not yet FDA approved, that are still undergoing clinical research or review, and it allows for tracking or utilization as you're building your evidence base for FDA approval or as you're building your evidence base to get you to that Category 1 level. So those are kind of the basics of coding in terms of when you're looking at a technology. But again, as I mentioned, having a code doesn't guarantee payment. Coding is only step 1 in terms of sort of defining or recognizing a service. Then you have to take a look at what a payer's coverage policies are for a particular service or device. And there, the Medicare policies in the U.S. are transparent because it's a national public payer. Oftentimes, a state's Medicaid payment rates are also transparent. And here in the U.S., Medicaid is a state-based program for individuals who might be lower income, and then each state sets up its own parameters, but because it's a half federally funded, half state program, you can oftentimes find the payment rates for the Medicaid programs as well. And I should also note that because we have this public-private payer blend here in the U.S., when you're looking at your technology, it's important to understand who the likely payers are to be for a particular technology or therapy. And that will also help you identify where is the research that you need to conduct. If you are looking at, let's say, for example, hip replacement, knee replacement, you might intuitively say that's going to be a more elderly patient population that is going to be Medicare. So you might want to focus your initial research on what are the Medicare coverage policies for hip and knee replacement. Conversely, if you're thinking about congestive heart failure, you may say that this demographic might be one that fits into the Medicaid payer buckets. Maybe you want to focus your efforts on Medicaid initially. Or you might be thinking that you're looking at a diabetes patient population which spans Medicare, Medicaid, and now also into the commercial market. So it's important to keep that lens as you're thinking about reviewing a technology. So you start with the coding, you go to the coverage, and then you have to move to payment, which is how is a payer reimbursing for the technology. And as I mentioned, when we're thinking about payment for services, it really is going to depend upon where the device or where the technology is being used. For services that are rendered, again, in that inpatient setting, acute care hospital, those are already likely to be bundled into a single payment. When you're thinking outpatient department or physician office, it really depends upon the device. There's some technologies that get bundled into those CPT codes, which means that the cost is already captured in. There's also oftentimes opportunities for separate payment for the device depending upon the nature of the device that's being used. So again, it's going to be something that you evaluate on a case-by-case basis.
Great. That was really useful. I'll let you catch your breath, Fauzea. Thank you for such a great presentation. We have a couple questions that have come through more from entrepreneurs at this point. I will turn those to you. So we have a founder asking a question. His firm is developing a new technology for tumor ablation. his question is that if he has the reimbursement guides of other ablation technologies, so FDA predicates, can he assume that the reimbursement model for his technology will be the same for this, for the same and similar procedures?
It depends, really. I think that the great starting place is to look at the predicate device or system to see what CPT codes exist, what the payer landscape looks like. For something like tumor ablation, what you need to really focus on is the technology, or is the service the same? So in the U.S., the CPT codes define the service, and you can only use the CPT code if it adequately, exactly defines your service. You can't be similar to another service. You can't have the same outcome as another service. You have to be the same exact service. And the AMA creates the CPT code, and then they also give additional information in terms of the description of the service, where they will say the pre-service includes prep, draping of the patient. They'll say that the intra-service includes the incision, ultrasound guidance for, the ablation, the tube into the lung, liver, wherever it may be. And then the time that it takes for the patient, or for the physician, to actually perform the ablation. And then they'll very clearly define what's included in the post-procedure, the closing of the incision, talking to the patient and the caregiver, follow-up care, etc. They're very specific about how they're defining a service. So looking at the predicate device is a great starting point, and then you want to do a more detailed dive into how similar or different is your technology service compared to the existing one. And then it's always nice to talk to clinicians in the U.S. who are familiar with the existing technology to get their perspective on any similarities or differences. In the case for ablation, the cost of the capital equipment is going to be bundled in to the procedure already, potentially, and so that's another area that you may want to just explore is how is the capital equipment for the current ablation units already being paid? How are the disposable components of the ablation already getting paid? Where is there opportunity for you to piggyback on what's already there if that's adequate, or what are the opportunities for you to change that reimbursement to better reflect the cost of your technology and your supplies.
Great. So we have another question, and you sort of addressed this in your last answer, but maybe we can touch upon it again. This person asked, what are the few things that are absolutely required to demonstrate to payers sufficient evidence for them to approve reimbursement?
That's a great question, and I wish I had the answer. I would definitely be.
There's no magic bullet
at this point. Exactly. It really depends. It depends on the technology. It really depends upon the service and what type of evidence a payer is going to want to see in order to support positive coverage. As I mentioned, FDA approval is just opening the door. Beyond that, there could be high evidentiary needs or lower evidentiary needs based on the therapeutic area. When we think about areas such as oncology, there might be greater latitude within the payer, to allow for, use of ablation technologies or higher cost drugs or more, experimental quote-unquote products relative to other therapeutic areas. So it's really product, service, and therapeutic area specific. But it's important to do that research in advance. And as I mentioned, for most medical procedures, payers provide a rationale as well as the clinical literature that they have utilized as the foundation for that determination publicly in their policies. And so even on the commercial side, an Aetna or a United Healthcare here in the U.S., if they have a policy, let's say, on radiofrequency ablation of the lung, they will provide a rationale as to why they've limited it to a particular subpopulation. What is the clinical literature that they referenced and pulled? What was their perspective on the study design? What was their perspective on the clinical endpoints? They oftentimes provide a lot of that context to the consumer so that they can better understand why a service is being covered or being restrictive to certain populations.
So kind of a follow-up question. And this, I think, is probably appropriate whether you're an investor or whether you're an entrepreneur trying to get a new product into the market. Obviously, novel, inventions don't necessarily fit existing definitions. So how likely is it to get a new CPT code if your technology doesn't, sort of out of the box?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So oftentimes, the commercialization opportunity for new and novel technologies, particularly within the remote monitoring space, as we look at the growth in smart applications and Fitbit biometric feedback technologies, it becomes challenging because the healthcare system hasn't evolved as quickly as the digital landscape. This IT infrastructure is growing more rapidly than payers can put their arms around. So the benefit category becomes very complicated. There are opportunities, however, to partner with individual providers, individual integrated delivery networks, or individual payers to support utilization of your technology. I think oftentimes technologies in that new and novel space fall short of being able to show the clinical evidence or the clinical improvement aspects of the technology early on, which can oftentimes hinder adoption. Because having information is great, and I think from a clinician's perspective, information is great, but only if you can tell me how I can use that information to better manage my patient or to change their care plan. And then you need to also tell me how does changing that care plan then lead to improved outcomes, reduction in costs. And that's, I think, where new and novel technologies sometimes struggle is the need to generate that evidence, to generate that value message platform initially when they're launching. That's why partnership opportunities can become critical because it allows you to demonstrate the clinical utility actively in the marketplace while continuing to build that evidence base and utilization momentum. And I'll also add that that's another area where you can think about direct-to-consumer. Sometimes these new and novel technologies just lend themselves more to consumers or to caregivers to better help or manage a patient relative to targeting a payer or targeting even the physician or hospital.
So I just wanted to inject a it's not really a case study because I'm not going to go that deep, but one of the, Argo, what you're saying, we invest in a company that has created an exoskeleton technology where people who are confined to wheelchairs are able to finally walk. It's a company called Argo Medical Technologies, and it was rumored recently that they're applying, filing for an IPO. But what's interesting here, it's a very expensive device. It's $50,000, $60,000, but it has the ability to change people's lives. Like literally, people who are confined can get up, and we have interviews and case studies with people who ended up walking marathons. Never thinking that they were going to walk again. And so, on a one-by-one basis, what people are doing is they're reaching into their own pockets, or they're doing sort of community funding. They're about $50,000 to $75,000. These suits, and they're raising the money, and then they're going on a one-by-one basis to ensure to sort of petition them to get reimbursed, and the company's feelings, at least, that sort of that groundswell of consumer interest in the device will help to put additional pressure upon them to get approved. I just thought that was an interesting kind of case study from our end, something that we've invested in personally.
And I think we're seeing more and more cases of that. I mean, I would say that most publicly we see that in terms of on the drug side of the marketplace, the pushback on high costs and encouraging payers to cover new or cutting-edge drugs. But it's interesting that you can also see that on the medical technology side as well.
Yes, definitely. We have a practicing surgeon on the call who has a question for you.
Okay.
Actually, Philip, that's a question. It sounds very specific to his case. I think I'm not going to ask you that. I think Philip, if you want to ask Fauzea directly, you can email her. But we have Peter on the line, who's a practicing surgeon who has an idea for modifying an existing surgical device.
Okay.
So in a case like that, do you know what changes can be made without an FDA okay?
I think that you are still going to have to go through. And first of all, that's a regulatory question, and I'm not a lawyer. I only play one on TV. But my guess is that you are going to still need to go through the FDA approval process for making any adjustments to the device for commercialization here.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think.
So.
Okay. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Zach.
Oh, I was gonna inject. I'd like you to finish your thought.
I was going to say that, so in that case, whether we're thinking about modification of an existing device is a great sort of, a case study or question that we can walk through. You're in all likelihood, you're still going to need to go through FDA for approval for that modified device. But then it would be very interesting to then see what are the existing codes for that device. How is the cost for the device currently factored in? What is the value messaging of the modification of that device? Does it reduce the hospital length of stay? Does it improve outcomes? Does it improve functionality so that the patient returns to the activities of daily living more quickly? All of those are the different factors then that you would need to consider as you think about where is the existing technology and how does your modification, reduce those costs and improve quality of care.
And I think, Fauzea, in answering that question, I think you actually you addressed Philip's question as well. I hope that answered your question, Philip. I think that's it for questions. Fauzea, what's the best way for people to get in touch with you if they have questions, either from an investor side or an entrepreneur who would would like to learn more about your company?
Sure. I think that they can reach me at my email address, which is presented here. You're more than welcome to give me a call, shoot me an email. We do a lot of work with investors in reviewing opportunities on medical device, inpatient, outpatient technologies. We also do a lot of work with entrepreneurs who have really great ideas, and they're just in the initial phase of thinking through the development of a particular type of software or technology. So we definitely appreciate the opportunity to work with various stakeholders in their development cycle. So email, call, either would be fine.
And I have to admit that the way we got in touch with you, Fauzea, was through an Israeli representative of the firm, Debbie Gardner, right?
Yes, that is correct. And so Debbie is located in our Israel office and does a lot of work with our Israeli customer base as well as our customers in Europe.
Great.
And I think, Zach, we can also give her number for those who are local to that market, if that would be helpful.
Sure. I think I'd like to include that. As I mentioned, we did record this. We do have the slides that Fauzea used, so we typically follow up our webinars with an email with some of those materials, so I can include Debbie's email address and phone number there as well. That'd
be great.
Well, Fauzea, thank you for a great presentation. I learned a lot. I think you did a great job of providing both an overview and trends sort of in the marketplace right now, and then drilled down into sort of the mechanics of how some of these things are working. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.
Great. And with that, I'd like to conclude the webinar. Thank you, everybody, for sharing your valuable time with us. And let us know if this was valuable to you, if you'd like to drill down further in future presentations. In any way we can provide more value to you guys. Have a good evening.